Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Suez and Aldersgate Group event on the role of the circular economy in getting to net zero. I'd like to thank you all for being here, both our in-person audience and our virtual audience, and I'd like to also say a big thank you to Suez for hosting us today. That's much appreciated. So I'm Nick Mollo, the Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group. For those of you who don't know us very well, the Aldersgate Group is a membership organisation focused on providing policy solutions on a range of environmental issues and looking at how we can tackle environmental problems in a way that's not only environmentally effective, but can also deliver a wide range of economic benefits. So you'll see from the slides behind me that our business members come from a wide range of different economic sectors. And within that, we have businesses who have very much a global presence, or at least a pan-European presence, which will be really useful for our discussion today, where we'll be touching on the role of resource efficiency, not just here in the UK, but in other markets as well. And we also have leading academic institutions and NGOs as members of Aldersgate Group who feed into our work very regularly. Now, in terms of what we do, we work across the spectrum of environmental policy, from climate policy, where we focus on anything ranging from the decarbonisation of buildings, of the power sector, heavy industry, but we also work on nature restoration, on resource efficiency, on green finance, skills, and trade policy. But it's fair to say that resource efficiency has been one of our most important policy topics for the last 15 years. And that's not only the case in our work in the UK, but also the case for our work in the EU. Now, for us, resource efficiency is in many ways the unsung hero of economic and environmental policy. Now, to put this in context, a few years ago, the Aldersgate Group took part with RAP, who are also in the room today, which is great to see, in a project called Rebus. Now, the whole point of the Rebus project was to help about 30 businesses in the UK and the Netherlands to develop more resource-efficient business models and to really try and learn lessons from those projects in terms of what works, what doesn't work, and where are new policy solutions or regulatory solutions needed to support business. Now, the projects involve businesses working in a wide range of sectors that were worth around 350 billion euros to the EU economy. So we're looking at electronics, construction, furniture, textiles, and a range of other sectors. And importantly, the project involved large businesses like the likes of Sky and Samsung, for example, but also it involved an awful lot of SMEs. A good example that I often quote here is we work very closely with a company called Natural Mat, who are a manufacturer of mattresses. Now, the experience of working on those projects and overseeing all these different pilots really showed us the significant economic and environmental benefits that comes with improving resource efficiency and developing resource-efficient business models. Now, just to give you an idea, and you'll see that sort of summarized on the slide, just within the 3 years of those projects running, the scale of benefits delivered by this project was quite significant. So projects in aggregate resulted in 5.5 million euros of financial savings, over 62,000 tonnes in material savings, and close to 2,000 tonnes in greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now, that may not sound like much, but when you think that a lot of these projects involve SMEs, these were actually really quite significant savings. Now, our partner RAP in the project did then a very interesting piece of work, and they looked at what would happen if you replicated the resource-efficient measures that businesses had taken in these pilot projects at the level of the economy as a whole. And that extrapolation exercise showed us that actually, if we drove resource efficiency to a same degree across all the sectors involved in Rebus, we could help increase gross value added in the EU economy by up to £320 billion by 2030. We could help cut material use by over 180,000 tonnes by the same date. And critically, in the context of COP26, we could cut greenhouse gas emissions across the EU economy by over 150 million tonnes. Yet, the importance of resource efficiency, both in economic terms but also in its capacity to generate emission reductions, is often overlooked, both at a global level but also at the level of national policy. So I think a good example here at COP26, you'll notice that we have a range of theme days throughout the COP. We don't actually have a day dedicated to circular economy or resource efficiency, which is actually really quite surprising when you consider some of the benefits that I have just been talking about. Now, in the EU, The EU has done a good job of talking about circular economy for a number of years, and you may have seen last year the EU publish, or the Commission publish, its Circular Economy Action Plan. Now, that action plan does provide quite a broad programme of work and policy work on resource efficiency. But again, when you compare the state of European policy on resource efficiency to, say, other areas of European climate policy, such as carbon pricing, energy efficiency, renewable energy, the whole resource efficiency piece is a lot less developed, has a lot less policy detail. And at the national level, let's talk about England a little bit. Back in July, the Aldersgate Group published a report called Closing the Loop, where we worked very closely with our academic, NGO and business members to really look at the state of England's resources and waste policy. And the overwhelming finding that really came out of that work is that in England, the resource efficiency agenda really suffers from a lack of profile. It suffers from a lack of cross-government coordination. And by and large, most of the policies in this area tend to be disproportionately focused on the late stages of the product life cycle, rather than being focused on incentivizing better product and infrastructure design, which is where you can really generate the biggest share of material, emission, and financial savings. So working closely with our members, we made a range of recommendations in that report, which I thought I would briefly touch on, just to give you a bit of a case study to anchor today's events. One of the main things we called for was much greater degrees of cross-government collaboration. We specifically made the point that the UK's Finance Ministry, the Treasury, the Department of Business, the Department of Housing, the Department of Transport should all be involved in resource efficiency policy making alongside the Department for the Environment. We really need that collective input in what is not only an environmental area of policy, it's also an economic and infrastructure area of policy. We also call for a range of measures to improve product and infrastructure design, make resource-efficient products more competitive in terms of upfront cost, and also we put forward a range of measures to increase consumer demand for more resource-efficient products and services, and that's a part of policy that's also often overlooked. So that included us calling, for example, for mandatory eco-design standards with resource efficiency criteria. We called for extended producer responsibility schemes with fee modulation, green public procurement criteria. We talked about variable tax rate to make resource-efficient products more competitive. And importantly, we talked about the importance of having coordinated consumer information campaigns to really help drive that demand for more resource-efficient goods and services. And importantly, we also looked at the people dimension and called for the introduction of a comprehensive low-carbon skills strategy to make sure that today's workforce and the workforce of tomorrow are equipped with the skills they need to do the jobs that will be created in a transition to a net zero emissions economy. And that's, I think, a topic that's very hot, very important to CWEM this year, which Adam Reed is the president of. So the aim of our event with Suez today is really to explore in more depth the role of resource efficiency in the context of COP26 and climate policy more broadly, get a sense with our sort of international panel as to how different markets are doing on this agenda, discuss in a bit more depth some of the key policy levers that can help accelerate the move to more resource efficient economies and really support businesses in shifting some of their business models. And we'll be looking at the people dimension as well, really thinking about what kind of skills will be in demand as we move to a more circular economy, and how can we ensure that the business community, the education system really follows that need for skills. So I'm delighted that we have such a great cross-sectoral, international and multidisciplinary panel. I'd like to welcome my co-host Adam Reed, who's the External Affairs Director at Suez. And Adam regularly reminds me that Suez is not a waste company, it's a resources management company. And I think that really embodies the shift that we're talking about today. Caroline May, who's the partner and head of environment at Norton Rose Fulbright, and also a director on the board of Aldersgate Group. Greg Lucas, who's the sustainability manager at IKEA. Philippa Spence, who's managing director at Ramble UK. Martin Casey, who's the Director of Public Affairs Europe at cement manufacturer Cemex. And last but certainly not least, an old friend of the Aldersgate Group, Terry Ahern, Chief Executive of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. So we should have a good 20-25 minutes for Q&As at the end of the event. So whether you're here in the room or you're online, please submit as many questions as possible, and we'll do our best to go through as many of them as we can. So I've given a challenge to our panel. They each have 5 minutes to give their thoughts on some of the questions that I've just highlighted. So without further ado, we'll kick off with Adam.
You want to stay?
No, you can sit down, you can come here, whatever.
I'll stay sitting, thank you. I thought you said I was the eternal director. Which is outrageous, but thank you nonetheless. It's great to be here on what is our 4th session of Suez hosting events or co-collaborating on events, thinking about why we're not on the agenda at COP. But I think we are on the agenda at COP because we're here with a room full of people and hundreds dialed in around the world listening to an expert panel. So let me kick off. I think our sector, it's not about resources and waste at all, Nick. It's about our sector facilitating decarbonisation, net zero, the greening of every other sector. And I think, the representation here today and over the last 2 days, whether you want green agriculture, green manufacturing, green transport, there's a role for resource efficiency or circularity or just more recycling, but ideally less consumption. And I think, working with your supply chain and your customers, we're on a journey of not only talking about what bin do you want and when should I collect it, but actually, well, what's in your bin? When should we be collecting it because your bin's full? What are you doing about your process in order that you've got it in the bin in the first place? And I think, that's a kind of journey that I think we've all got to go on together. So that's where I'm starting from. But our sector has gone on a bit of a journey. I mean, we've reduced emissions in our sector, if you want to define it in that way, by, 44, 45, 46% over the last 20 odd years. But I think that's the wrong way of looking at the equation. Why define our sector as waste and resource management and draw a box when our job is dealing with somebody else's rubbish? So I think a lot of the time I want to break down that narrative and recast the question a little bit and say, what is it that I can do for you? And Martin's at the other end, and you'd almost think that he and I had a coffee 10 years ago and came up with climate fuel, but we didn't. But the two companies worked together over a period of time. They had an issue, we had an issue. We've got somebody else's rubbish that needs a home. He's got an alternative fuel that needs to be created, and between us you can create multiple benefits for multiple players in a value chain. And I think that's the creativity of industry, although we need Terry to play nicely to make sure that from a regulatory perspective it doesn't hold us up whilst we're trying to do the impossible. So I think there's some great examples, but earlier we were listening about food waste in London, and I think when you think about it, 70% of food wasted in the UK is post-farm gate because of citizens and what they do at home or when they're out and about, which is even worse. But then you ask citizens, and this is some RAP data, 81% of citizens are concerned about climate change, and yet 37% realise there's a connection between wasting food and climate change. And I think, there's another narrative, isn't there, in terms of we're not on the right agenda, we're not being talked about in the right narrative. So again, how do we plug that gap? How do we make sure there's a common language? Whether my mum wants to talk about resource efficiency or circularity is irrelevant. Is she doing the right thing is all I'm interested in. And then we can put a system around that. Refurb and repair, topics that are close to both of our hearts, Nick. I mean, huge job opportunities, billions in UK gross value added, 30,000 new jobs if we were to get that right. Green Alliance have done some fantastic work looking at that. But how do we get there? Who's setting the policy agenda? Because that kind of stuff, you can only do so much of it from a bottom up, and then it starts to become really hard. So I think, again, you've got to join some of these dots up. And I think that's why it's important that we're arguing for a more cohesive view of this space from all of our perspectives, because we all want to do the right thing. We all want to move to servitisation. We all want to go to leasing models. But then you need a system to support that. We're not capturing rubbish anymore. We're now making sure that materials come back in a format that can be repaired, refurbed, cleansed, return to good models. So, fast fashion, I won't bore you with the facts about fast fashion, but that it's bad for the environment, yet we're still buying the stuff. So who's talking to my sister about her consumption patterns? Because she ain't listening to me, ever. and then finally, I think, there's some interesting targets out there, and the ESA, the trade body for our sector, has come out with its decarbonisation plan between now and 2040. And there's technology options, carbon capture, utilisation and storage, absolutely. New projects getting funding from BEIS recently that Suez are actively involved in. But that's still back of pipe. It's end of solution, isn't it? End of pipe. And I think, we've got to get back to what are we buying, what kind of model do we want to live in. So huge opportunities, but still a little bit frustrated that we can't quite navigate to get a seat at top table.
Could you, first of all, I love the fact that you always bring in your family in all this. I've heard a lot about your mum's journey towards a more circular economy, but first time I hear about your sister's difficulties with the agenda as well. So it really helps bring it to life. Now you have a range. If you were to cherry pick one major frustration, so you talked about we should be at the top table, we're not. But is there anything in particular in terms of how policy is evolving in this area that you really desperately want to see change?
There's hundreds, Nick, but I think I'm going to pick on waste prevention. And you look at the strategy in England, which was out quite recently, the waste prevention plan for England. Some voluntary targets, some ongoing collaboration. I mean, nothing new, nothing groundbreaking, nothing that's about consumers really. I just think if we're serious about getting away from waste, you've got to have a policy environment. You've talked about it, whether it's eco-modulation on EPR, or whether we're talking about eco-design on products and such like. We just have to take the debate here. Yeah. And then you can start to put in industrial processes and systems and service provision. But if we keep talking, you look, all the policy reforms are happening in England and Scotland and Wales to some degree at the moment. It's all about making recycling work better. Yeah. It just, ambition's not there. If you want to go decarbonisation, it's not recycling better.
Yeah. Well, that's a good note on which to move to Caroline. Caroline, as a lawyer that works with a very global but also cross-sectoral client base, you've been frustrated for a while with the pace of change of policy in this area. So can you tell us a bit more about how important you think it is and how you think we're doing?
Sure. Well, thank you. Just to counterbalance Adam's mum and sister, I've got a son who's very wasteful, so I can throw that into the mix. Just have some gender balance, because there's a lot of ladies in the room. I thought, just speak up on that basis. The law, as ever, follows behind policy, follows behind society largely. There's a problem, then somebody manages to pass a law to try to fix that problem. And that's been part of my frustration with the legal frameworks around this whole sort of waste sector. So in 2008, we had the Waste Framework Directive, which was the starting point, if you like, the line in the sand for trying to come up with a legal definition of waste, and then trying to come up with the application of the waste hierarchy to try and get us through to end of waste. At that time, that seemed like a bit of a breakthrough, although, of course, trying to define and enshrine a framework around such a variegated sector was very difficult. So the concepts of discarding and intending to discard were essential in terms of identifying waste in the first instance. Once you'd done that legally, then it was in the sausage machine till you got to end of waste, and then you could declare something officially end of waste. Well, that seemed fine in the lawyer's office. That all seemed good. We had words, we had a framework. We could get people like Terry to enforce it for us. But of course, the world is not that simple. And then suddenly, all these cases started to come up. The aggregates industry. Is it a waste? Is it a raw material? Do I recycle it? What do I do with it? If I can't use it, what can I do? Can I put it in the road? Will the agency let me do that? What can I do? We had then a plethora of cases before the European Court on the definition of waste. The majority of cases went all the way to the European Court to try and get some sort of reasoning and clarity around what was waste and what was end of waste. And although we got lots of cases, we still didn't quite get the clarity. And I remember going with Nick and a group from the Aldersgate Group to meet President Juncker's aides in Brussels, pre-referendum, to talk about the circular economy. And they really wanted the UK to take a lead on this. They felt that the UK was quite a long way ahead in its thinking and in its regulatory patterns and its definitions. So they said, after that vote, come back and we'll get the UK to lead in the circular economy. Nick and I were ready with our return tickets. They went in the bin, had to be refunded, can't waste the ticket. And so obviously the UK lost an opportunity, I think, at that point to lead on the circular economy. But nonetheless, the circular economy continues, and there have been amendments to the Waste Framework Directive, and the UK has signed up to be part of that circular economy package. And the debate has moved on a little bit. It's not so much now about identifying waste, but repurposing waste. And there's been more clarity around what is end of waste, when you need to find a solution and a purpose. And I think there's been a recognition that identifying waste and classifying it was only the first step. Now trying to repurpose and reuse it, and for the law and the regulation to allow that, it almost felt sometimes like the law was trying to stop you repurposing, and you'd be saying to the regulator, but this is the environmental outcome we want. Yes, but the law won't allow it. Well, that was crazy. You've got law working against policy and direction of travel. And I think we have moved a long way since 2008, and I think there is a recognition at regulatory level that we do need to repurpose and reuse, a bit like certainly my grandparents' generation did, so it's gone full circle. So the law has certain drivers. Is the law enough? No, clearly not, but there needs to be a framework and there needs to be a taxonomy so that when you're talking about aggregates or you're talking about coffee cups, there's at least some generic way of saying, look, this is how you need to deal with it through the waste hierarchy. So we're on that journey. There are some steps still to go. Single-use items, government's talking about through the Environment Bill, looking at ways of penalising either through law or through financial penalties, use of single-use items, trying to repurpose. Litter, my personal bugbear, to come back to my son to finish off with a familial reference. I organised a litter pick down our lane. There aren't many houses down our lane. There's no street lighting. There's no recycling. We gathered 38 bags of rubbish in under an hour in a rural lane in Hertfordshire over Easter. Within 3 weeks of me walking down that lane, my husband and I, my husband lugging behind with a bag to put all the waste back in again that we'd picked up less than 3 weeks before. So my son, who watches the David Attenborough and stomps about, what am I doing to save the turtles? And I said to him, what are you doing to pick up the litter down the street? It starts here. And that picks up on Adam's theme. We all create waste, but it's not Adam's problem at the end of the chain. It's all our problem. And it starts at home. So if I can get my son to pick up the litter and to create less, and we all do that, we're going to have less of a problem. But I think there are improving, encouraging signs, and looking at what the European Union are talking about, starting from cradle to grave, eco-design in a product. So when you're thinking about the car, you have to think about what's going to happen when it's ready to be scrapped and what you're going to do with that. And I think that's going to be the new dawn, and the law, as ever, will follow a little behind, trying to pick up the pieces.
Thank you, Caroline. It sounds like you should join forces, both of you, with your children.
That'd be quite a good combination.
I think I'd reflect
case study.
Indeed. On a more serious note, are they? You have clients who come from a range of different jurisdictions. Do you get a sense that some countries are doing a bit better than others on this agenda, or understand it better, focus more on the early stages of product life cycle and so on?
Yeah, I think inevitably Germany has been quite a way ahead in this scenario. It's got much more prescriptive product regulation, looking at consumer-facing product, and much more prescriptive packaging, waste and labelling requirements for country of origin and what needs to happen. And I think Germany and the Scandinavian countries are ahead. I think we're somewhere middling with Netherlands and others. And then I think there are still challenges in North America and South America, where certainly in the northern part of America, obviously it's a very consumptive culture. And in South America, there's less resource, if you like. So there are challenges, but I think that we generally tend to look to Germany for the gold standard. And when clients ask us to do a global review, we normally then have to, we can have a general review across Europe, but then we pass it to Germany and say, tell us, and you find the greater prescription there. So, and I think that shows in their recycling achievements that they have been ahead of the game for quite some time.
Thanks very much. Caroline. Now, Greg, really pleasure to have you on the panel. I think you're very much one of the global retailers that have one of the most sort of advanced sustainability strategies, and it's not a 2050 strategy, it's a 2030 strategy. Now, within that, you've got the ambition of being not only climate positive, but also a circular business. And I notice you have a range of objectives around decoupling growth of your business or material use. You've got very specific objectives around reusing secondary materials to make new products, and you want to engage your consumers more through repair services and so on. Why are you putting so much emphasis on that and not just focusing on the climate bit?
So a big thank you, Nick, and the Aldersgate Group and Suez for inviting me along. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for giving up your time, both here in the room and in the digital world as well. And to answer the question, I think to start off with, we need to look at IKEA's overall vision. We're a purpose-led organisation, and our overall vision is to create a better life for the many people. We're experts when it comes to life at home. And when we talk about life at home, it's not just the four walls that we live in, but also the local communities as well around us. So I know IKEA's been on a journey. We're reassembling the entirety of our value chain, as you heard from Nick, particularly to transform to become climate positive by 2030 and to transform into a circular organisation by 2030 as well. But also to enable and inspire the many people to live a more healthy and sustainable life at home too, and to create a fair and equal society. So we're a little busy, as you can imagine, at the moment when it comes to our sustainability strategy known as People and Planet Positive. So, and linking into what Nick was saying there about becoming climate positive and our focus really on 2030, we're in the decade of climate action at the moment, and that's kind of one of the areas that I really want to talk to you about. There's been a wealth of action within IKEA, and particularly in IKEA UK and Ireland. And when it comes to circular IKEA, I think maybe 5-6 years ago, if you had walked around a number of our shops and spoken to our co-workers about, well, what is circular IKEA? What is it that you're looking to achieve? It would be a little bit around, well, we want to prolong the life of products. We want to look at the materials that we're utilising and designing our products, but probably not necessarily going too far beyond then. I think about 5-6 years ago, as Nick was saying, we introduced textile take-back through the Rebus programme, in fact. And that kind of framework of starting to develop circular business models allows an organisation to embed a framework around innovation. And you heard from Nick a number of the fantastic statistics from the Rebus programme. I think the one thing that I take away is that all those individuals within IKEA who were involved in developing a new business model, involved in kind of changing, amending, reassembling the way that we do business, they took away with them a new mindset. And what we've seen is kind of a far more rapid pace and acceleration in terms of action. We have circular hubs now in every single one of our stores. Those circular hubs employ 400 people across the UK, many of whom who have skills in terms of carpentry, in terms of repackaging, in terms of being able to take products back, be able to repair them and resell them as well. But not only that, they can also walk out of their circular hubs, engage with customers and undertake workshops with them around personalisation and skills development and a whole raft of other areas. And we co-create a lot of that with our customers. We don't have all of the answers, and we need far, far more collaboration, not just amongst retailers, but with the people who are interacting with our business on a day-to-day basis, with the many people. And beyond that, we also, within that infrastructure part, we have free spare parts. And we've introduced even more new circular services and business models, and one of them being our buyback and resell service. So this is where our customers can bring along IKEA furniture, IKEA products. They can bring them to the circular hub. They can even watch them being repurposed by those 400 individuals working in our store and many more, and be inspired by that. And then those products are often resold within the circular hub. But those customers want to leave a message on their products. This is one thing we've started to see from this service. We call them pre-loved labels. On those pre-loved labels, those customers write a little story about what that item's meant to them over the 5, the 10, the 15 years that they've had that item in their house, that it's moved with them. And what we find is a real emotional connection to the next person that's coming along to buy that item, to understand the journey that product's been on. So when Nick asks the question, why have we taken circular or resource efficiency and kind of made it central to our business? Well, it's something that customers have been asking for, I think, for a number of years. They haven't been asking, excuse me, can you develop a circular economy? They've been asking, how do we make products more affordable, more accessible? How do we ensure that those products can be personalised? If we want to personalise them, how can we kind of evolve them? And how can you add on the services that customers are really asking for? So it's that co-creation part with our customers. It's our co-workers as well that are asking for it. And it's the need for change and innovation, and that new mindset, I think, is really kind of the driver for a new circular economy. And it makes sense. It makes sense on every level. We talked about pilots, and I think the time for pilots is kind of, we're there, we've tested. We've proven that we can get there, but how do you rapidly replicate and scale that? That's where there are still a number of questions, I think.
So on that point on scale, so you operate in different markets. Some of those markets will have quite stringent regulations, so markets, Sweden, UK, but you might also be present in other markets, emerging markets, for example, where regulations might be less stringent. Is your approach to how you implement your sustainability strategy the same from one market to another, or are there discrepancies?
It is to some extent exactly the same. Every single part of the IKEA organisation utilises that same people and planet positive strategy that I was mentioning to you all earlier on. We all have exactly the same vision. How we implement it is generally the same. There are obviously some opportunities to kind of mould that to each market, to mould that sometimes to each community. We do a lot of work on a local community level around each of our stores. And you may find between different stores there are slight differences, but overall the process of the model is generally the same. And that allows us, and if you take buyback and resell, and it was first piloted, I think, in Edinburgh, not too far from here, for a couple of years. It was rolled out across the UK and Ireland, and it's rolled out across global IKEA now. If we went over to Paris, if we went over to IKEA in India, you could see the same type of service.
Excellent. Just before we move to Philippa, another question I wanted to ask you. There's been a lot of media coverage in a run-up to COP26 and actually in the first couple of days around the commitments being made by businesses. And one of the observations that's popped out in a few places was around the fact that if businesses take on those targets, they should be solely responsible for delivering them, and they shouldn't be expecting particular policy developments or regulations to help them out. You've got very ambitious targets out to 2030. How much of it can you deliver by yourself, and to what degree do you need the help of, do you need policy and regulation to catch up with you?
So one of the most ambitious targets, I think, when it comes to circular IKEA is that all of our products will be made from recycled or regenerative materials by 2030. And the services kind of encompass that as well, to ensure that our products are both affordable, they're accessible to the many time and time again. And I think those commitments we know we cannot achieve alone. We need to collaborate not only with other businesses, with our customers, with community groups, but with policy as well. And I think in a number of the discussions we've had around developing a circular economy, and I've only touched on kind of the tip of the iceberg of some of the action that's been undertaken over the past few years. We've heard a lot from DEFRA in the UK, we've heard a lot from BEIS. We probably haven't heard the same amount, I think, from the Treasury or other parts of government around these areas, not just in terms of penalties, but also in terms of incentives. And I think that, as well as taking on kind of circular procurement, are two key areas. By government procuring more circular products, materials, services, etc., that stimulates the market as well to be able to respond to that and to move with that too.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, Greg. Before I move to Philippa, just a reminder to think of some good questions for our Q&A, including if you are online. We're using the Slido app, so do submit some questions. Now, Philippa, Rumble provides engineering advice on a wide range of different infrastructure projects around the world. To what extent does improving the resource efficiency of those projects really help with their sort of embodied carbon and overall emissions?
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be on an Aldersgate event. It's key. It's absolutely key. So it's really interesting. The building sector is one of the largest contributors to global emissions. Approximately a third of global energy end use ends up happening in buildings. And of course, there's an enormous amount of embodied carbon as well. The built environment, so looking beyond buildings only, uses almost half of the world's extracted materials each year. And if we think about the future, so if we expect that there are about 10 billion people that we're expecting in the world by 2050, and the current building stock will have to double to be able to accommodate all of those people. So if you try and imagine that, it's about a city the size of Paris being built every week. You can just imagine then the enormous amount of resources and materials being used and the incredible amount of carbon emissions that comes along with that. And the problem we've got in the built environment is that it's actually a wasteful sector, if I'm to be completely honest, at this point in time. It has too much of the linear take, make, waste approach and not the circular economy approach. And we've done too little to modernize. So without drastic change, there's a real risk that the built environment will be seen as a climate villain in the future. But there's also a lot of good reason to hope. There's a lot of, because if we are able to use circular economy and resource efficiency in the built environment, actually it's one of the key ways in which we will reduce carbon emissions going forward. Now, there are 4 principles which the World Green Building Council have identified, which I find really helpful in a piece of work that we actually help them with, which is called bringing embodied carbon for upfront. And I'm going to talk about a few of them, but the 4 principles are to build nothing, to build less, which means repurposing existing assets, build clever, so use low carbon construction, different kind of materials, and build efficiently, so different technologies, efficient technologies, and trying to eliminate waste. Now I'm going to talk about the last 2, build clever and build efficiently, from some research that Ramboll's done. Now, this research is really interesting. In the UK, we did some research that showed that the UK industry is over-designing systems and structures as a result of commoditized and kind of play it safe approaches to design, which are understandably trying to seek compliance, but are also really about trying to reduce design time because of pressure on fees. It is a sector that is under huge price pressure. But what this has meant is that it actually providing up to 50% more electrical capacity and 30% more heating and cooling capacity than is ever needed. And that's extraordinary when you think about it. Structures are also over-designed. So our research has shown that design loading in offices may be more than double the loading that's will ever be needed or a building will ever experience in its lifetime. So we've done a lot of engineering in extreme environments for the British Antarctic Survey. And the interesting thing about Antarctica is that there are no building codes. So for the many years that we've worked there, we've had the privilege of being able to explore safe, lean and efficient design, partly because that's absolutely the ethic of Bass and it's absolutely the ethic of Ramboll. Now we've learnt a lot through that, and we've seen that you can do it differently, and we've developed approaches called extreme for lean. And we found that the approaches that we've used in Antarctica can absolutely be applied in cities like here in Glasgow. We're also looking at different kinds of materials, and this is really interesting. We're looking at what we can use to replace concrete and steel and under what circumstances. So at the moment we're doing a lot of research in cross-laminated secondary timber. And it can't be used for everything, but it certainly can replace concrete and steel in some instances. And it's that kind of research that's needed. The other point I wanted to make was around modern methods of constructions. That's off-site or modular construction. That involves fabricating a building in smaller units called modules, which are then transported to site and assembled there. And there are some real benefits with those, and there are tons of them, but I'm just going to share a few. The one is that it really decreases construction waste significantly, and that's because compared to a traditional construction site where you get a lot of waste, actually a lot of the materials can be reused in a factory environment. Because they can be used for other products and projects. The other thing is it reduces the amount of transport to site by around 90%, according to our research. And also finally, it's much more energy efficient because the fabrication takes place in a factory environment where it can be controlled compared to an open construction site. So we really need to do more of that. And then my final point is on the build less. We do need to repurpose our building stock. The greenest building is the one that's already built. Not my quote, but a great quote nonetheless. But I just want to make a couple of points around policies. Resource efficiency in the built environment has to be enabled, encouraged, and enforced by a great framework of government policy. As the built environment and those that work in it will not do it on our own. Now Ramboll, because of our values and because actually of our brand, we have chosen to double down on a focus on sustainability. That's the type of service we provide. However, not all companies can, and not all companies will. And there are very good reasons for that. You know, all private sector have to make a profit. And at the moment, there's disincentives to investing in research and development that's really needed to push this. So I've got a very long wish list for the government, but I'm only going to give you 3 points.
Go for it, go for it.
Building codes really do need, at the moment they focus primarily on operational energy and carbon, but they do now need to include embodied carbon, both in the building codes but also in material specifications. And then Nick, you mentioned tax systems. Tax systems at the moment really do favour new builds. In the UK, by way of example, new builds don't attract any VAT, but any repurposings, so any work that involves repair, maintenance or adaptation work attracts 20% VAT. Totally counterintuitive to any effort around circularity. And then my final point is just that we've got to teach people to do this. Our engineers, our construction workers, our architects and our scientists need to be taught how to do circularity, how to build circularity into their thinking. And that means building it into degree courses and into industry training boards. Those of us working in the built environment, we can change to be more resource efficient, but we can't do it alone and without the support of enabling policy. We really need to have government completely alongside us with this. Otherwise, I fear we will not get there.
Thanks very much for putting very detailed points on policy as well, which is really helpful. You talked a lot about the importance of improving resource-efficient design and how infrastructure is developed. From the different, I mean, quite similar question to what I asked Caroline, but from the different markets you operate in, are there particular markets that are taking this particularly seriously that you think sort of set the gold standard that we should aim to be following?
It's interesting because I did read that question ahead of, and there actually isn't. There isn't one that stands out. Initially, I was thinking, well, perhaps I've seen more of this in buildings, and so what I would say is we've seen some really great examples, both in the public and private sector. So when we're talking about companies that choose to get a green building or a sustainable building, a repurposed building, there's usually a very, very good commercial reason for that. So either it's because they can use less materials and that actually there's a cost benefit. The repurposing means they don't have to acquire land, there's no complexity there, it costs them less, or because there's a brand issue. They know that the kind of client they're trying to attract will be really it will appeal to them, that the fact that it's green and circular. So we're seeing some great examples there. Public sector is actually problematic because there's a lot of desire, but the public purse is pretty empty. We've seen some good examples. So one of them that I was looking at is the Net Zero Carbon Hospital Standard, which is in draft at the moment. Fantastic document, shows the direction of travel. But again, it's draft, it's an aspiration, and so I'd see really good efforts in many places, Nick, but simply not enough to scale.
That's really helpful, thank you. So we're going to go from the world of engineering to the world of cement manufacturing, and from the perspective of Scandinavian businesses to the perspective of a Mexican business. Martin, you spoke at an event with Aldersgate a couple of days ago on industrial decarbonisation, and you made the point there that the Global Cement Association is committed to net zero and has put forward some quite tangible commitments there. The UK Cement and Concrete and Aggregates Group has done the same. What's the role of resource efficiency within those commitments? And to what extent do you think resource efficiency deserves to be a topic that's really spoken about at COP26?
Okay, thank you, Nick, and thank you for the invitation to participate in the panel, and for Suez for the invitation as well. You're right to pick on that. It's not something that gets talked about enough, and I think we're all in agreement on the panel about that, and it has its place, absolutely. It really should be on the agenda. For a company like mine, like Cemex, a manufacturer of cement, supplier of concrete, it's fundamental. It's absolutely core to our business. The way in which we can approach net zero and reducing our carbon impact is directly connected to resource efficiency and the circular economy. The two go hand in hand, and without one, we don't get the other. So it's absolutely fundamental. I mean, manufacturing cement, as those of you who aren't aware could probably guess, is energy intensive. And that energy needs to be, that the energy that we use needs to be as effective and efficiently used as possible, because it represents over 40% of our variable cost. So there's a self-interest in a commercial term for getting that right. But it's also a fundamental lever for reducing our carbon impact of the final product. And this is where the move away from fossil fuels to fuels made from alternatives that are derived from the waste stream has been key, and is key to the delivery of zero carbon concrete going forward. And that's where the relationship that Cemex has with Suez comes in. We use unreusable and unrecyclable materials that are blended into a fuel to replace fossil fuels in our kilns. We're currently in the UK using over 60% of our thermal heat requirements from those sorts of sources. But just this year we've invested around about £20 million into our fuel system at our cement plant in Rugby, which will enable it to reach up to 100% replacement level going forward and eliminate the use of fossil fuels. And this is something that we are replicating not just here, but already in our European operations. Some of our cement plants are operating at over 80% replacement in Poland and in Germany, for example. But it's also something that we're aiming to replicate on a global basis. So it's not just here in Europe, but in North America, Central America, the Far East. These are things that we're doing. And it's not just Cemex, but it's an industry issue. And this is one of the key levers. But the really interesting and important thing is that we're not just addressing it from a fuels perspective, but again, working with companies like Suez, we're looking for alternative resources as raw materials. So instead of relying solely on quarried product, what else can we use, repurpose to be a raw material that can go into the process? And there are some interesting developments there. And that is another lever that we can pull in order to reduce the carbon impact of the cement manufacture, and ultimately the carbon content of concrete. But also, at the end of life, concrete is 100% recyclable. So once it's there, I completely agree with this point about, a green building's one that's already been built, don't build another one. Concrete's fantastic for being able to repurpose a building. And it's also, I think, really vital that we understand that as climate change does impact around the world, for resilience, for the resilience of infrastructure and for housing, it's really important that these buildings can withstand the changes that are coming. So that's key. And we're looking at innovative stuff as well. So cements that haven't been reacted that are already within concrete, whether they can be extracted and reused, for example, is an area that we're looking at. So the whole discussion here is totally relevant. In terms of policy, I'd say that the biggest inhibitor, as far as we're concerned, is a lack of uniform adoption, implementation, and the way in which the regulation is approached. And I'm not necessarily talking about here in the UK, but I'm talking more generally across Europe and beyond. Certainly, whilst we've got good policies in place, such as the waste directives that we've heard about, they're not implemented in the same way across the whole of Europe. And while some countries are very, very good at it, others are lagging behind. And that is inhibiting us being able to go as far as we'd like to go in delivering on these things. But I think what's really interesting, and I'm going to anticipate a question here, Nick, about other markets and what we're doing elsewhere, is what is really interesting is that because this is such a fundamental lever for Cemex to achieve its net zero commitment, that we are working in other countries in Central America to try and encourage the similar types of legislation to the waste directives. So we are using the model that we have from Europe and the way that the regulations are used and applied here in Europe to inform the debate in places like Mexico and Colombia. So there are regulations in development in those countries that are taking the model of Europe and the learning that we have as a company and the experience we have as a company here directly there. So I'm talking to my colleagues in Central America and in Mexico about these things. So there's the transfer both of the legal and regulatory type approach, but also the experience of how you actually implement it at an industrial level.
And that transfer of know-how is really, really interesting.
Absolutely.
And where companies like yours can make a really big difference. I had a couple of questions for you. The first one is, I'm curious to know the extent to which your client base asks you questions about how resource efficient your cement is. To what extent is that an area that you're being asked to sort of show how well you're performing this agenda? How much is reusable, recycled, and the like?
It's variable. I'd be lying if I said that was the regular question you get asked. There are, let's say, clients who do have those because they've got their own targets and agendas, and they need to know. So we have a carbon calculator that we use, and we can provide very precise information as part of an input to a whole project. But it's increasing. That interest and those requests are increasing. But I think what's really important is how, and we've heard about this from others on the panel, about how the public sector approaches this. And the public sector tends to be ahead of the private sector when it comes to some of these requests and these needs. And so public procurement can actually be the real driver in this area. And having the right standards in place there actually can really encourage, but also facilitate companies like mine being able to make the necessary investments to deliver on net zero. That certainty that the market is there and there's that pull through is absolutely vital. So,
and is that in a sense that if you've got the right criteria in public procurement, then basically if you're a private procurer, you're going to ask for the same thing?
Well, you'd hope that it has that impact and effect, but also you can put in place minimum requirements. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily 100% agree with Philippa on some of the things, but I think we do agree that changes are needed to construction codes. And I agree with this point that over specification, absolutely. Construction is conservative with a small c. If you're a structural engineer, you don't want to take any risks. But there is efficiency to be taken out of the system, as Philippa has rightly said. Now, the material you then use for that, I would argue you should be using concrete, and we can deliver on low carbon and zero carbon concretes. And we already sell lower carbon concretes, and we can, with some offsetting, we can provide 100% reduction already today.
So, and you talked in your initial observations about the importance of genuinely collaborating in order to make your products more self-sufficient. So having to really look at, I guess, what resources you can get from other sectors to put it into your own production process. Do you proactively look for partners like Suez, or is there an element of sort of chance encounter? I mean, I guess another way of asking the question is, how did you meet Adam?
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't go into that one. But seriously, it's proactive. It's a proactive relationship. So we know what we need to do, and we know that we need to talk to companies who can help us deliver on that agenda. Yeah. And it's great when you find a company like Suez who is willing to look into how they can supply you with your needs. And that industrial symbiosis, that ecosystem that develops, is fundamental to having a proper circular economy. And I think that's the one thing, not just for my company, my sector, but for all industry, is to understand where that industrial symbiosis is. What byproduct from any industry can be a source of raw materials or input for another. That is absolutely fundamental.
Yes.
And I guess that comes back to your observation on public procurement, that if you get that market signal, it almost forces you into that space of looking for that industrial symbiosis.
Indeed, and we've, as a company, we've participated in some work funded by the European Union looking at a clustering approach to industries which can have a symbiotic relationship. Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting.
Excellent. Thank you. It's always really important to have a regulator on these panels. And Terry,
I love the way all the eyes just look at me.
Yeah.
To do what to?
That's why we've put you on the edge of the panel.
Yeah, I know.
Don't get too excited, could fall off. So you've always made the point to me that the Scottish Environment Protection Agency really wants to distinguish itself by being a very pragmatic regulator and having very clear environmental objectives, but you want to work very closely with the business community and encourage new approaches, encourage innovation. Can you tell us a bit more about your work how you go about this and your work specifically on resource efficiency.
Okay, and as with others, thanks to Aldersgate and Suez, it's great to be here. It's my first COP event that I've been at, and it's a deliberate choice. I knocked back most other invitations. I think this is a really important forum. So I run a monopoly organisation that's enshrined by public law. You'd think that's a pretty safe business. I think my sector, which exists in every, certainly OECD country, I think we're at risk becoming the typewriters of the environment sector. And let me go through why. So our strategy for regulating is called One Planet Prosperity. It's very deliberately chosen. So Mathis Vakernagel, who invented the ecological footprint, I've worked close with him for 20 years. We launched Earth Overshoot Day from Scotland last year and this year. If everyone in the world lived like Scots, you would need 3 planets. And that's pretty much the same across the UK. The country I come from, Australia, you need 5. Now, you think about that running a business. If you say last year our costs were 3 times our revenue, and it was the same the year before that, and the year before that, and it's going in the wrong direction. At your 2-day executive loving, you don't say, oh gee, we better have a 5% surge in sales or a 3% productivity push. It's existential, which is why people are meeting across the river and why they met in China on the nature crisis. You say our business model is not working and humanity's business model is not working. So you think, what do EPAs or EAs or natural resources whales, they're all called something a bit different. What do? Well, like typewriters, we have been hugely, hugely beneficial to humanity. So typewriters are incredible for years, that's how you produced a typed document. Who dominates the global typewriter market now? There must be someone who makes them for films from the 1950s or something, I suppose, but wouldn't be exactly a winner. EPAs have created success by intervening in points in systems and largely reducing local pollution. Now, Scotland's environment is way cleaner because SEPA has existed and has done that for 25 years, as same in England, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this big global meeting across the river? It's because systems are broken. They're not there talking about points in systems. They're saying, how do we have a different financial system? How do we have a different agricultural system? Et cetera, et cetera. The business model for running an EPA is no longer fit for purpose. And I actually said to my previous minister the first time I met her, if we keep doing what I call phase 1, then take our 70 or 80 million and spend it on doctors, nurses, teachers, which was a year before the pandemic, so it probably might have been a good thing to do. Now again, just be clear, that business model for phase 1 was hugely beneficial, as typewriters were. But regulators have to change. Go to some simple facts. We only have one planet. So our strategy called One Planet Prosperity is the best regulator ever created, like I want SEPA to be the best, like any CEO of an organisation. There's no question who the best is. It's the planet. It's regulating our behaviour now because we're overusing what the planet can support, so it's changing the climate, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if that's the case, and we need to change systems, EPAs to be of use, you think about it really, what do we need to do by 2030? We need to largely decarbonise and dematerialise. That's, the point of today is the dematerialisation is critical, and that also should help with decarbonisation. And if we don't do that by a lot by 2030, it's game over for our species. The planet will be fine. I'm not interested in saving the planet. The planet will be here. It'll be radically changed. It's whether we're here and how many other species we take down with us. So if you're going to massively change systems, what do you need? Massive innovation. Massive innovation from all the businesses sitting to the right of me on the panel. What does an EPA need to do? What does innovation involve? Risk. The more you innovate, the more you take risk. Why do those things go together? Because then the more return you'll generate. All of you hope that you'll create much better commercial returns than your competitors because you'll be offering people services and products that are in line with what One Planet can support. And that is the biggest business case we've got. So if you all have to innovate and we regulate you, what does a regulator have to do? Have an appetite for embracing and sharing risk. Whereas in our DNA, it's the opposite. So I'll just finish with one example. I could cite examples from Scotland, but they're probably all commercial in confidence. Because if businesses we regulate want to explore things, then we have to protect the confidentiality of what they're doing until they go public with it. So I use a Northern Ireland example. I ran the Northern Ireland Environment Agency for a couple of years. So we had a cement manufacturer, and we had a poultry producer, Moy Park, the biggest poultry company in the UK. This was after the horse meat scare, so a couple of the retailers said we want to source all of our meat from the UK just as a security of supply process, and they wanted to end reasonably long-term contracts because it was a big change, etc. Chicken waste is high in nitrates. We were already over the nitrates limit on watch from Brussels, so we had a big problem anyway. Moy Park had the opportunity to double production. How many times does a business have the opportunity to double production? In a country, or nation, province, it's very difficult in Northern Ireland to know what you're supposed to call it, that is still struggling to come out of the troubles. It's a huge opportunity, and the finance minister said to me, there's a lot of low-skilled jobs here. We've got people who will never get high-skilled jobs. What he was really saying was we've had men who were in paramilitary groups for a long time. That's their skill base. We need to find other things for them to do. They're not going to become architects, etc. So you had this opportunity. We went to the cement company and said, could you trial using the chicken waste as an alternative fuel source? We also got them to look at used tyres. Now, I don't know if this is the greatest thing to do with these types of waste, but that would have helped solve the nitrate problem, one environmental problem. It would have. Northern Ireland has a very high greenhouse gas intensive energy system, or it did when I was there. So this would have reduced the greenhouse gas loading of cement production if it had worked. Even in a tiny place like Northern Ireland, 1.8 million people, those two companies never would have talked to each other. But we regulate them both. Why can't we sit there and say, why can't your waste be an alternative fuel source over here, as others have done? So I think regulators, if we're going to be of use, everyone to the right of me has expressed ambitions for what they want the business to do, which isn't a little change. None of you talked about a little change. You've said we need to change radically. Well, we need to change radically, otherwise we will be in the way, as a couple of you have said. The final point I make is, in my customer base, I have to fix the local pollution that is our traditional market. So Grangemouth, our biggest industrial area, high carbon, we're in charge of the regulatory hub for the government, just transition to low carbon. I have said there two things. One, this will be low carbon, no question. The only question is how. Does it go because no one will buy high carbon products 5, 10, 15 years? That'll just happen. Or do we keep the technology? One of the places that was the heartland of the original Industrial Revolution, we do the next one there, create the businesses of the future that are low carbon. That's one question. I said the other thing is not a question. If you make that massive transition to being low carbon and all the benefits, and 2 households are putting up with unnecessary industrial noise or odour, I cannot go to them and say, look, could you just shut your windows for a decade because we're dealing with climate change over here. I can't do that. I have to solve their problems. In my market, I have no credibility to do the innovation and the support of risk-taking if I can't solve the basic things. So I think if we want to leave behind our typewriter phase, which delivered a lot of value for the environment, and move into the iPhone or smartphone phase or whatever, that's what we've got to do, embrace risk and work with others in that way.
Well said.
Really good points. Thank you. You touched on something really important, which is fear of failure. And a lot of the time, some of the frustrations we come up against in our work, whether it's, say, in heavy industry, where we often call for particular pilot projects to go forward, which require a degree of capex and which rarely happen because of the degree of money at stake, or whether it's to do with some of the examples Adam gave earlier in resources and waste policy, where a lot of the things that need to be mandatory are often introduced on a voluntary basis. There's always this sense of fear of failure, and officials being really concerned about things not working and not necessarily embracing the fact that sometimes you need to learn by doing in order to be able to come up with the right frameworks. How, you're obviously trying to overcome that. Are there any lessons you can share in terms of how, government officials and other regulators can follow that example?
Yeah, so who holds you to account for failing is the question. Who or what process? So what we need to do, we have 6 organisational characteristics, which are the usual things. They'll either mean nothing and they're just corporate fluff. They're blah, 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 as some famous Swede might say. Or they'll actually change what we're doing and they'll create some benefit. Now, one of them is that we will routinely be in boardrooms, executive suites and with owners of small businesses. And what I would say to the people we regulate come in at that level, because in the typewriter phase, the phase 1 phase, nearly all the interaction was a middle level engineer trained person from an EPA dealing with the same sort of person in the factory, doing the right things. That was the focus. If you're talking about innovation, changing product design, et cetera, that's lots of the technical people contribute, but the decisions are made at senior levels. I would say have early discussions. If I give an example, Scottish Water, we have what's called a Sustainable Growth Agreement, which is just a voluntary partnership. In Northern Ireland, we have prosperity agreements. In the state of Victoria, I created sustainability covenants. I can't run a fourth EPA because I've run out of names for these things. But with Scottish Water, we have to manage water differently. You think of wastewater treatment plants. We spend billions and billions of pounds building them and running them. What are they called? We're investing billions and billions of pounds in infrastructure to make it easy for people to waste the environment. That's what they're called, wastewater treatment plants. Now, you can't change the entire system overnight. They're running billions and billions of pounds worth of assets. So have a go at one treatment plant, or have a go at one bit of blue-green infrastructure. Sign a voluntary agreement. Get the people who have a stake in it going wrong in the agreement, or as partners with the agreement. So look, we need to trial something here. If this company doesn't have a go at doing it differently, it can't make improvements, but it's different, it's new, it might go wrong. And agree what the success factors are, what the failure factors are. Try and design it in a way that if something goes wrong, the environment won't get damaged too much, you can quickly adjust. Get the people with a stake in it going right to say, how do we share the risk and return if it goes right and if it goes wrong?
Thanks very much. I think we'll want lots of people to listen to this. I think it's absolutely critical that we take more and more on this approach. And we're trying to decarbonise entire economies in less than 3 decades. So we need to try new things. Right. So we've got time for questions now. So we've got quite a few questions coming online, but great to take some questions from the room as well. Kate's got a roving mic, and we'll have a prerogative at one point to ask a question as well as she's holding the mic. So. Do you want to ask your question now, Kate?
Yes, I shall commandeer the mic selfishly. So clearly, there's not an elephant in the room here about changing consumption behaviours, but at the Aldersgate, we find that in conversations with government, that is the case. They're focused much more on the end of the waste hierarchy, and it's very difficult to talk about policy priorities for actually shifting consumption patterns. So I wanted to ask the panel how we get that onto Whitehall's agenda, and what the top policy priorities would be for actually decreasing consumption in the first place.
Thank you, Kate. So, and then I think we had a question over there, sir. Third row.
I think we'll let the panel answer.
But we're taking several questions on the go, because they're not all going to answer the same question. So
all right. Well,
we like mixing and matching.
I've got questions for 4 of you.
Oh, right.
But I'll try and make it concise. What I want to do is just sort of like approach the most difficult things out of each of your fields to deal with, starting with IKEA. IKEA have an innate problem with most of their stock at the moment, where they actually use 1% of the world's wood, and most of their furniture products that use that wood laminate it with plastics and glues to the technosphere, if you like, things that are high pressure laminates, plastics, etc., that can't be put back into the ground. Understanding that IKEA has a policy to take back, because you're a global system and because you have global logistics, you have to deal with environments that don't have the capacity to take back, and a lot of the products that you produce go out into communities where it's very difficult to return. So is there a material basis, and are you saying that you'll totally eliminate these? Second question.
So I think we'll take that question first, plus Kate's one. I've got a couple of questions coming online as well, which I want to throw in now, and then if we can, we'll get back to you. We're trying to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions. So we've got that question that I think, Greg, you'll be best placed to answer. But I've got that's all right, Martin, if you want to have a go. Couple of other questions coming from the virtual audience this time around. One of them, which started being directed at IKEA, but I'm going to direct it to the whole panel, was to what extent is product sustainability reflected in the price when you develop more sustainable products? But I would like to broaden this question to Martin and Filippo as well, in the sense of when you produce more resource-efficient materials or infrastructure, to what extent does that have an impact on the price, one way or another? And the other question I want some of you on the panel to answer, and we may get to hear of Adam's sister again, is how do we communicate the circular economy to citizens? I know you love that question in particular, so I'd like to involve you in that as well as others. So we've got 4 questions. The engaging government on consumption patterns, how do we communicate the circular economy to citizens? Impact of sustainability or resource efficiency on price, and then that very specific question to you, Greg. Do you want to kick off with the specifics, and then I'll give everyone a time to think about the answers?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're completely right, and completely openly and transparently, I think IKEA's highlighted for a long time exactly percentages that we've used, not just for wood, but for other materials as well. And we are on that journey to 2030. And everything is focused on transforming the business around that, not just from a design perspective. So when I said by 2030, all of our products will be designed from regenerative or recycled content, that's a complete change. You'll see more and more and more the products that potentially are selling really, really, really well, and high value products are needing to be changed almost completely. And those are decisions that quite some time ago IKEA took and said, yeah, this is the direction we're moving in. If we don't move in this direction in the longer term, i.e. past 2025, we potentially won't be here. We won't have the trust of our co-workers and our customers who are asking for this. So there's a wealth of work going on at the moment to look at exactly what are those alternative materials. Is it still wood? How can we utilize it in a better way to meet all of the circular design criteria? The key part around it, I think, when it comes to overconsumption, is then looking at the circular business models. And we talked a little bit, there's repair, there's reuse, there's take back, there's buyback and resell, and there's probably a couple of others that you can include into that. And I think one of the great things that the Rebus project did, kind of looking to Terry as well, about that kind of systematic change and that collaboration to bring others along on that journey, hopefully before 2030, is to develop a program like that again. And the Rebus project brought together business, it brought together different government departments. It didn't just provide the numbers that Nick was saying, but it brought that kind of mindset change as well. It brought charities into the mix, community groups into the mix, and you've seen IKEA in a number of different countries when talking about take back and what do we do with those products once they're on the market, once we've reused them as many times as possible, what happens to them then? And there's been a number of cases of IKEA, I think, and other retailers as well, investing into community groups to ensure that those materials can be broken down, or there's new ways of looking at recycling. But I don't want to focus it on the kind of towards the end of the natural life of materials. It's more around how do we continue to prolong the life of those materials. And the affordability piece is absolutely key as well. So it's using those democratic design principles that I think, again, are open source, but you can also see the circular design principles along that. And we've been completely open and honest around a lot of the challenges that we face. We run competitions with SMEs and startups and a whole host of others. It's not something that we can do alone. And this is where we move from kind of partnerships towards that real radical collaboration, to say, this isn't something we can do alone. We need support, we need to trial, we need to test, we need to fail as well, and learn for that with others to progress.
So you're not sure how you do it?
We do. No, we have a strategy. We don't have all of the answers, I think, to all the different materials. I think, yeah, there's still room for support and development, but I think we're already some way along that journey. And if you look at packaging as an example, packaging already has hit around 75% of our packaging is made from recycled materials. I think when it comes to products, at the end of 2019, it was about 10% that's made out of recycled material. So you can see we're moving along on that journey. The learnings that we've had, we need to replicate and scale and accelerate, but yeah, we're not right at the beginning.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of businesses with net zero or circular economy strategies have some answers, but not all the answers for how they're going to get there. And I think that's fair as well. So it's not a transition you're looking to do overnight.
No, definitely not. And just to say that those circular business models are a really, really key part to that solution as well. That overall circular strategy is absolutely key to getting there.
Thank you. Philip and Martin, I'd like to move to you on that affordability question. And what's the impact of sustainable infrastructure design, sustainable cement? What's the impact on price?
There is a price impact. You do try to pass that through to the customer, but the customer is currently not always willing to pay that price, especially when a commodity like cement, which can be imported quite freely and is imported and increasingly into a country like the UK. So that's been sort of the situation up to now. I think and we addressed this in the initial comments, increasingly clients though are asking for more sustainability credentials, and especially in the public sector, tender documents are requiring you to meet certain standards. So increasingly it's becoming important. So it is built into the price that you're quoting for it, but it's part of the requirement of the project. So that's increasingly happening, and I think that's important. So procurement policies, as I said before, are actually they're key. So the right procurement policies can really help drive this. The other thing, though, is in a case like cement manufacturing, where we need to make significant capital investment in order to deliver on a net zero agenda, which we're committed to, we need to ensure that it doesn't price us out of the marketplace. And that's where you need both the procurement policy to be right, but also to have potentially things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, so that anybody who is doing that import is being held to and judged on the same basis that you are, so that it's not possible to supply into the market without the carbon cost being taken into account one way or another. So I think you need to do it on both sides.
Yeah. Philippa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, it's incredibly context specific, I would say. So sometimes it does offer, taking a resource efficient and circular approach offers actually savings, because repurposing a building can actually save compared to building from scratch. I would say that's rarer. Often there is a cost involved in a similar way that you've described there. But the reason I say it's context specific, because it also is about the accessibility of those recycled materials. If they're geographically close, if they don't have to have a huge amount of repurposing themselves to be able to be usable and safe, then you're on a winning wicket. However, I would generally say that the clients we're working with who are really pushing the envelope here are doing it because they believe in it firstly, but also they're looking at the whole life, if you like. So they know that they've got clients willing to pay extra because they're going to be working in or leasing a sustainable building. And ultimately the way in which it's designed means that there'll be greater resource efficiency around energy use, water use and so on, and that ultimately there is a kind of cost benefit to that. I think my final point is that often it does, to be able to tell the story, you've got to do a cost benefit analysis, which isn't typical for if you're just going to do it the standard way. But we're seeing, optimistically more and more clients actually doing that and saying, right, we are going to invest in something that's different and sustainable and green.
Thank you. Caroline, one of the questions before I go to Adam and Terry was around, how do we communicate circular economy citizens, but how do you communicate it to businesses and clients? How do you engage them on that?
Yeah, I think education is key, and it depends what sector you're working in and how essential it is to your particular business sector. And what we've found is that clients who have a consumer face are much more sensitive, not always on their own account, but they are sensitive by reference to their nearest competitor. Yeah. So we had things like the carbon reduction commitment and league tables a few years back, which didn't quite achieve what it was supposed to. But what people were really bothered about was where they were on the league table by reference to their nearest competitor. And if there was a consumer face to that, coffee chains, not to name names, then people were really concerned to get to the top of the table. So that competitive edge, which is human nature, has a key driver in terms of driving behaviours. How do we educate? How do we explain circular economy? Well, it starts with Adam's mum and sister, my son, all of us here, in understanding it, and COP is a case in point, the educational factor, the raising the consciousness and awareness. So it won't take place just at political level or at regulatory level, but I agree with Terry, the regulators need some room to take risks and support innovation, which I think the law doesn't always allow them to do. So we need to look at that in this area. Education, and it starts at home. So I think, and this is some of the things I've been talking about in this conference, is let's not demonise certain sectors that we've all been quite happy to use until fairly recently. Look at what happened when the petrol ran out recently. Nobody was demonising oil companies then. They were all screaming, where's the petrol? We're all on this journey together. So nobody has all the answers. Nothing's perfect. But I think raising in consciousness, education, and learning from each other, collaboration, that's got to be the way to drive this forward, get it out there into the public consciousness. And I see COP and hosting COP as a key factor for UK PLC in doing just that.
Adam?
Well, I think COP could have been a great opportunity to help educate a lot of people about the significance of resource efficiency or circularity in reducing, you know, not only our environmental footprint, but also in generating, you know, new business models that you know, could have helped us on the green recovery. So I think it's a shame that it's not as central as perhaps it should have been, coming back to the initial question. But how do you put it on the political agenda, which is one of the other questions you asked, Nick, so I will come back to the other one. I think, you know, the more evidence that we create, and I mean, you know, in the last 2 days at these sessions, we've seen reports from London and RAP and ourselves giving that evidence where, you know, doing something circular or taking a triple bottom line approach or looking at it with a different lens is not only good business, but you're getting payback in the right period of time. It's working. You're now taking customers on a journey, and as those customers go on a journey, you create a groundswell of evidence. And the groundswell of evidence now makes it much more politically interesting because it's about local jobs or local businesses or the new norm. So I think we've got to continue on the journey as sectors and as advocates and as, you know, campaigners almost, to create that groundswell so politicians can't ignore it, and nor can the you know, their machine, if you like, back at Westminster or elsewhere. Coming back to my sister and my mum, I'm going to talk about my son actually. He's 9. He opted out of the environment club at school. That's not cool, Dad. I know what you do for a living. It's not cool, Dad. And his mum works in the industry. That's not cool either. And I think there is something here about, I don't want it to be cool, I want it to be norm. And I think if we're talking about circularity, I've lost my mum. You know, she may have done 20p deposit, 10p deposits, 5p deposits back in the day on Corona bottles. You know, she's of that ilk, but that was the norm. It wasn't trying to convince her that it was good for the environment or, you know, this was going to protect a blue whale or a turtle. It was just the norm. And I just think we have to create norms that are easier and therefore better for the environment, and not enable people to continue to be wasteful or to take an easy option. And that's partly about taxation, it's partly about externalities, it's partly about the true cost of the systems that we live in. If it was harder to throw rubbish away than it is to recycle it, you'd get a change. If it was harder to buy virgin than it is to buy recycled content, you'd get a change. I think that's the step change, not the education per se, it's the ease of the transition.
Yeah. Terry, I mean, you've got a wide range of responsibilities towards the citizen. I mean, how, any suggestions, how do you engage people on the agenda?
So if I make observations about working with politicians on it, so, and how do you get it on the policy agenda? So I've worked with politicians of all sorts of different ilks around the world, mainstream right wing, mainstream left wing, small sectarian based parties in Northern Ireland. A couple of things that most politicians share. First of all, whatever the public thinks, the vast majority of them want to make their societies better. They'll have wildly different ideas about what that means, but they actually do. The second thing is they're way better than most people at understanding what the public thinks, because unlike nearly everyone else in employment, they have to reapply for their jobs every few years. And so that what they really get is that in our psyche, so much is, when it comes to consumption, more makes you better, less makes you worse. That's why it's so hard to get it on the policy agenda. So if I think coming at it from what makes citizens better, happier, what's going to make them vote for you. If I take a personal example, my wife works and lives in London, so I'm sort of split between there and Edinburgh. We live a few hundred yards from Hyde Park, and in Edinburgh I live in the New Town. I haven't had a car since 2010 when I immigrated. And people say, oh, that's an environmental thing. You know, I said, no, it's just a better life. When I get in a car rarely now, 3 or 4 times, I think, geez, you can die. All these amateurs driving around. This is crazy. I hate it. I get on a train or a bus or a tram, I read, make a couple of calls, do some emails, whatever. Now, you can do that if you live in the middle of London or you live in the middle of Edinburgh. Most people outside those sort of centres can't do it because we don't create the... But that's the thing, my consumption pattern is less environmentally loaded, but I sort of like the fact that it's doing something for the environment, but if I was talking to a politician, I'd say, I want public transport, I want this, because that's a better way for me to consume. And it'll be easy to get it on the policy agenda if you start from what makes a citizen happier, et cetera, rather than from this is going to decarbonise or dematerialise, I think.
That's a very good point. It's going to segue nicely into the next question that I'll be asking. We've got time for a small round of brief questions. So if anybody else would like to ask a question, now is your chance. Yes, please.
Small and brief.
Yeah.
Hi, thank
Just
you.
to get the message across.
Hi, I work for Climate Action 100+, the engagement initiative, and what I see in the engagement with steel, with electric utilities, with food and beverage, etc., is that at the end of the day, these companies, when I talk about resource efficiency, they tell me this translates into less sales at the end of the day because they sell tons of steel, tons of food, like megawatt hours of electricity. And I've heard today very interesting policy intervention, tax. The other one was procurement contract, carbon price. Which one of those three or any other you would prioritize for policymakers to take to really encourage a circular, circular economy?
Very good question, thank you, and thanks for summarising the event for me as well. That was really helpful. It saved me a lot of time to tick. The other question that I wanted to ask, and I think I'll start with Terry because it goes at the heart of your One Planet Prosperity. The question that was submitting online: economic growth is still expected, but we're already living beyond our means, as you pointed out. Is fundamental system change needed alongside resource efficiency implementation? And I think it touches on some of the economic growth debates that we've seen in discussions on circular economy. I'll let you think about that. One's quite a big question.
Yeah.
What are the most, is a move to resource efficiency equating to less sales, and what are the most effective policy levers within the policy levers that we discussed today? Martin, do you want to kick off? There's quite a lot in that question.
Yeah, I think it's about trying to ensure that your commercial offering offers value, and if you're offering the value that includes all of these things, then you can, in a way, sell less but remain commercially competitive. And I think as we get the systems change, that will flip to become, if you're not doing that, you actually won't have a business. Mm-hmm. So there's a fundamental change that, and I think we're quite near the beginning of that process, but I think it has started. And it is a mindset change. You're quite right. You've got to figure out how you can sell less, but still be profitable, still make a return for your shareholders, still deliver social value. But I think if you're not doing that, you're not going to exist as a company. Mm. So embracing it is the key.
It's a very good response. Philippa?
I think more has to be done to create demand. I think that's really key, and that's why I come back to the need for policy intervention. There is certainly interest, but as I say, the construction industry and the built environment is one where it's hugely fragmented, very long, complex supply chains, often with competing interests, and that is not a great environment to really get that demand going. That's why we need the help of better policy that's really going to drive this.
Thank you very much. Craig?
So in terms of which of the choices, I think, out of incentives of procurement and other areas, and the procurement piece, I think, for industry overall is really, really key for the public sector to play that role, to play a central role to stimulate the market and to bring about new services and new products as well. Does it relate to fewer sales? And to some extent it depends. If you're moving to product as a service, and my friends and colleagues over in IKEA Netherlands have been trialling a whole raft of different product as a service models, and some of which have worked pretty well. Obviously it's less sales than someone coming along buying the product time and time again, but it creates, I think, a better journey. And as you were saying, if you're not embracing those types of models, it's highly unlikely as a business that you'll be around in the relatively near future. Mm-hmm. And it's something that our customers, our co-workers have been demanding for some time, something that we're starting to deliver, but we're expecting a lot more to come in the coming years.
Fingers crossed. Caroline, I think redefining waste is going to make it into your top three, but are there other sort of most effective policy measures?
Redefining waste, certainly, and having greater flexibility and allowing the regulators. So when I've been involved in novel technologies or novel methodologies, the regulators looked at this very narrow framework and said, well, we can't allow this because it doesn't fit within the R&D model, it doesn't fit within the framework. So greater flexibility for the regulator to work more closely with those trying to innovate, I think it would be in my top three. We've got an economy built on consumption, but consumption without consequence. And now we're moving to an economy with a conscience, if you like, for consumption. And I think what Martin says about the level playing field, having embedded pricing which takes account of carbon, emission reduction, resource resilience, has got to be built into the pricing model. If there's one thing I hear from clients and have in my 30 years legal career, level playing field is what everybody wants. So I think that's the transition we have to make with our pricing models, and the law has a role to play in that and a framework, and it needs some more rounded edges rather than to be so prescriptive.
Level playing field is very much what Aldersgate Group is seeking to embody. Adam, I'd love to get your thoughts as well. I realise I can't even call you a resources management company, but as a company that supports everybody else on the journey to net zero, as you pitched at the start, what do you feel are the most effective policy levers? And I would also like your thoughts before we move to Terry on that economic growth question as well.
Okay, number one, we already lease phones, cars, homes. So I don't think that change to buying less is necessarily as difficult as perhaps we think it might be. It's just how do you do that for textiles? That's coming with clothing, of course. So I think we're on the journey, and I think we just need to harness that and communicate that better in some respects. For me, it's externalities, it's true life cycle costs is part of the issue here. You know, if you were paying the true costs of the entire production process for the cheap T-shirt, it wouldn't be a cheap T-shirt. And then you might treat it better and you might use it longer, and therefore you're buying less of them. And I think that's a part of the journey is the true life cycle costs, which we haven't really got to grips with. And I think that's not just carbon, it's biodiversity, it's water, I mean the list goes on, and that's very complicated. And my mum doesn't need to understand, you know, all of the complexity. She just needs to understand that T-shirt ain't a fiver, it's 50 quid. Suck it up. Quote me.
She's online.
Probably. She usually joins. And then the question about buying less or economic growth with consuming less. I mean, it is the fundamental question of the day, isn't it? And I think, you know, we have to, the system change is either we do or we don't. And, you know, the panel have made that clear. I don't have a problem with buying less if you're buying the right stuff and you're buying the service and you're buying the brand loyalty and you're going on a journey. If I'm getting all the things that I need to make me happy, you know, and let's be honest, we buy a lot more experiences now than we did 10 years ago. So I think we can go on that journey if we understand what the options are, and there are options available. And I think it's the job of not just government, but all of us and a raft of stakeholders here today to help create those opportunities so that there are alternatives that are, you know, that either play to my environmental sense or play to my convenience or play to my, you know, whatever it might be. But we can bring people on that journey in different ways. It doesn't have to just be a legislative driver, but I think we do need legislative levers at certain points.
To encourage different types of consumption.
Indeed.
And Terry, to finish off.
So I'm a trained economist. I try and hide that from my staff. Earth Overshoot Day last year, which we agreed with Mathis to launch it from Glasgow because in the run-up to COP, and it was, I think, late August, and it was the first time in the 40 years that it had gone in the right direction because of the pandemic and the lockdown around the world. Well, it went back to 29th of July, I think, this year, and we launched it again in the run-up to COP. It was great. We got 2 goes because the pandemic popped off. Now, as you said, there's a couple more billion people coming. It's going in the wrong direction. We're using about, as a global society, about 1.5 planets. If economic growth means that, then no, economic growth can't get going. You know, we need to redefine. Humanity has a business model that is broken, and it's breaking us as a species. That's why there's people across the river. So, has economic growth had its day? well, what we think of as economic growth clearly has had its day. Unless it's completely redefined as growth in a different way about value that we really want, it just can't keep going.
Yeah.
Then you can pretend, et cetera, oh, we give a bit more services, a little less product, et cetera. It's cataclysmic what we're doing. You can't back away from it. That's just the science.
Martin, did you want to jump in? No. Okay, well, look, we've unfortunately reached end of the session. I think it was a really, really interesting discussion. I think you helped us all really better understand why the circular economy is so important in the transition to net zero and discussions that we're having here at COP26. We had a whirlwind tour across different sectors around different policy levers, from sort of product standards, infrastructure design standards. We talked a lot about demand measures, such as the role of procurement, both public and private, the role of tax, the role of education, consumer campaigns, and how to bring your mum and sister and son now actually, all of them, the whole family, on the journey. So I hope it's been an interesting session for both you in the room and those who kindly joined us online. If you'd like to find out a bit more about our work, do go on our website and you'll find there the Closing the Loop report that I mentioned at the start, which my colleague Kate wrote, where we have plenty of ideas as to how we can accelerate the move to a more circular economy. And you'll find many business case studies from businesses on the panel today as well. So do have a look. For those of you who can, do join us for a drink afterwards. If you're online, do have a drink as well, and we'll be thinking of you as well. And thank you for joining us. If we could just thank the panel in the usual way before going to drink, that'd be great. Thank you.